6K RAW 60 frames per second. This sounds mind-blowing how they managed to fit all these features and a lot more in a camera that is less than $3,000. And I'm sure many of us, when we saw the announcement, we rushed to pre-order our unit before really digging deep into the fine print and making sure whether this camera is good for you or not. I still cannot believe that we live in a time when soon I'll be getting the 6K version of this that actually shoots higher resolution than my 10 times as expensive RED camera. This RED is with the Gemini sensor, which has the dual ISO concept of this one. Yet this is for $2,500 and this cost me almost $25,000 plus to get it to the configuration that I have. I'm not here to talk about all the features of the camera, but the specific few that caught my attention, and give you my professional opinion as a DP who already owns the BlackMagic 4K, and I've used it in so many of my shoots already, and I found it really amazing. So the 6K really caught my attention, and what I want to discuss with you today will give you all the tools to make an informed decisions before you go and buy the camera. Let's dive in. Okay, so first thing is 6K resolution. Many people are asking why 6K, and it's a bit of an overkill, especially that most of us are actually watching things on 4K, if not even full HD. There's a lot of reasons for that actually for us as filmmakers. First reason is whenever you have a shaky footage and you try to stabilize it, the image is being cropped by the software that you're using. So if you're shooting at 4K, the resulted cropped image will be less than 4K in resolution. So now when you stabilize the 6K resolution, probably it will never reach the 4K margin or below. The second common reason is reframing. Meaning if you shoot a wide shot for instance, and you want like a tighter crop in the image, you can simply crop in it. And that's especially useful when you're shooting interviews. A third reason, which I personally used in many of my shoots, is pulling still frames from the footage itself and being able to use it as probably posters or something to print. Of course, this really depends on the quality of the camera. So with the 6K here, especially when you're shooting in RAW, you can use still frames as photos. Fourth popular reason that is commonly used amongst the influencers is to pull vertical layout video from a horizontal video. Meaning if an influencer shoots something at 16:9 landscape mode, they can still pull a full HD video but in portrait mode, which is 9:16. But now with the 6K you can actually get a higher resolution in portrait mode. One more reason is that 6K is very VFX friendly. Simply because if you've done any VFX work before, rotoscoping is pretty much a tedious work of selecting the individual moving part in an image, and the lower resolution the image is, the harder it gets for them to select them. So with 6K, the rotoscoping artist will really thank you for it. Lastly, and of course everyone have heard this before, is future-proofing your footage. Especially if you're shooting stock footage, for example, which could sit in the internet probably for 5 to 10 years from now. Probably by that time, 6K will be the norm, if not more. I'll be shooting a whole episode soon about this subject, so stay tuned for it. Now frame rates. The 4K breakthrough is shooting RAW at 60 frames per second, 4K DCI, and 120 frames at Full HD, which is a windowed mode, meaning that it crops in the sensor in order to get this 120 frames. Now the 6K shoots RAW at 50 frames per second 6K, and 60 frames per second 6K windowed, which is 2.4:1, or 60 frames 5K at 17:9 windowed mode as well. Keep in mind that ProRes is only limited to the 4K resolution. You cannot shoot ProRes at 6K yet. And of course 120 frames at 2.8K instead of Full HD like in the 4K. Also the 120 frames is cropping into the sensor to reach the 2.8K resolution. Now for the lens mount. As we know, the 4K has a micro four thirds mount, which is compatible with all the micro four thirds lenses out there, whether it's from Panasonic or Olympus, and all other third-party manufacturers. Of course, the micro four thirds has a 2x crop compared to the full frame sensor. As for the 6K, it has an EF mount with a 1.63x crop factor. This way you get a wider field of view. And of course you can use all the Canon compatible lenses on it. Now the trick here and the advantage of the 4K over the 6K is that with the 4K you can use a Metabone adapter or any other adapter to be able to mount EF lenses on it. If you're not familiar, the Metabone Ultra will give you a 1.43x crop factor and it will add 1 stop in your exposure. As for the Metabone XL, it will give you a 1.29x crop factor plus 1.3 stops of exposure. Something to think about. This is the first substantial fact that gives advantage of the 4K over the 6K now. Now let's compare resolutions. This is the 4K sensor resolution, which is 4096 by 2160 or 4K DCI. And this is the cropped resolution of the same sensor when it's shooting at 120 frames, which is pretty much full HD resolution. Now this is the 6K shooting at 60 frames, which is 6144 by 3456. As you can see, it's much bigger than the 4K. Also, the 120 frames cropped mode of the 6K is substantially bigger than the 4K 120 frames mode, which clocks to 2868 by 1512. Sensor crop factors is another very important point between the two cameras. I'll show you why. Of course, crop factors is based on the physical size of the sensor, not the resolution, so don't get confused with that. And crop factor also controls the field of view that the camera can see. So again, we have the 4K sensor, which is a micro four thirds, giving us a 2x crop compared to a full frame, and the 4K windowed version, which is the 120 frames, will give us a 4.24x from a full frame sensor. Now the 6K is a Super 35 sensor, which will give us a 1.63x. As you can see, it's not that much bigger in size, but still it will give you a wider field of view. And the 6K windowed mode will give us 3.54x from a full frame sensor. And this is the size of a full frame sensor just for reference. Of course, both of them are already relatively small in comparison to the full frame. Now let's keep the 6K ratios on the screen. This is when things will get interesting. If we add the Metabone Ultra to the 4K, it will give us a 1.43x crop factor, which is in fact bigger than the 6K crop factor of 1.63. And when we go to the windowed mode of the 4K with the same adapter, it will also be bigger than the 6K windowed mode, clocking up to 3x versus 3.54x on the 6K. Once more, let things get even more interesting and add the Metabone XL to the 4K, and you'll see how you can get 1.35x crop factor, which is substantially bigger than the 1.63x of the 6K camera. Also, when you put it on the windowed mode, you will get a 2.72x crop factor against the 3.54 of the 6K. I personally always use the Metabone XL on my 4K camera, offering me the 1.35x crop factor, which is the closest thing that you can get to the full frame. So now if you're planning to buy the 6K, you need to understand that your field of view is going to be narrower than the 4K with a Metabone adapter. Yet it seems there's an Italian company called Look Adapters out there that managed to create a new type of adapter that will actually drop into the lens mount and right in front of the sensor. It's more of a permanent solution that you're gonna install in the camera rather than a detachable mount like the Metabones. You'll need to be careful and have a little bit of dexterity to actually install it. This solution was originally designed for the Ursa Mini with an EF mount, which transforms the Super 35 into a full frame field of view. So apparently they're gonna create a version that will fit into the 6K now. Here's an example of the Ursa Mini's field of view without the adapter, and here's how it looks like with it installed. And here's how it compares to the Sony a7R III full frame camera. As you can see, you pretty much get a full frame field of view. And it seems that there's a little bit of an exposure boost as well. I'll see if they can send me a sample unit so I can test and let you know how it goes. Now the depth of field, which is probably one of the main reasons why I will buy into this camera. On the BlackMagic website, they will show you a comparison between the 4K and the 6K, which is fair enough. As you can see, the depth of field will be shallower on the 6K over the 4K, which gives you the aesthetic that is close to the full frame. Now for the ISO performance. We all know that both cameras have dual native ISOs of 400 and 3200. The only difference I noticed between the 6K and the 4K is that the 6K has a little bit of a shifted dynamic range into the highlights, meaning that if both are shooting the same scene, probably it will get a nicer roll off and details in the highlights over the 4K. Also, I would note that theoretically with a 6K sensor, the noise pitch will be finer, meaning that it might look a bit less noisy compared to the 4K. Now for the body and design, they're pretty much identical except that the 4K is 1.5 pounds, while the 6K is 1.98 pounds, which is 25% heavier than the 4K. There's so many things that they had the chance to improve actually from the previous design, especially this button in the front, which is still a bit weird to have two buttons in the same side instead of having one on each side from the front and the back. With that said, I would say that the 6K is definitely not an upgrade, but rather just a different version of the same camera with a higher resolution and a different lens mount. It's just like how you get a GH5 and a GH5S, or an A7S and an A7R. They're pretty much the same cameras, except that they changed a little bit of the components inside and maybe something on the outside as well. As for the price, we already know that the 4K is $1,295, while the 6K is a whopping $2,495, which is pretty much equivalent to two 4Ks. So keep that in mind before getting your 6K. I assume this price hike is because of the new sensor that they added there. Probably it's the same sensor technology but just a bigger wafer of the sensor. Now after many months of using the 4K camera, I wish they implemented those points into the 6K. So the first thing that's missing is a new battery. as we all know that the 4K is using the Canon LPE6, which lasted only for 30 minutes, and pretty much everyone across the board was complaining about that. Now they're claiming that the 6K you can get up to 45 minutes of operation time from the same battery. Probably one of the reasons why they didn't change the battery, because they already announced last April a battery grip that haven't even shipped yet. I pre-ordered one, it hasn't arrived. Yesterday I actually cancelled it, and instead I got the Tilta cage with a battery grip that can last me for almost 2 hours. So with that said, it confirms again that the 6K is not an upgrade for the 4K, but rather a different version of the 4K camera. Now about the screen, I couldn't really find the proper documentation of the actual brightness of the screen, but based on experience, I would rate it at 400 nits of brightness, which is very low if you're shooting outdoors. I assume that everyone already bought an extra monitor for it. I'm personally using the Small HD 702 Bright, which is designed for outdoor shooting, and it has 1000 nits of brightness. There's so many other options you have out there, but the most popular would be the Atomos Ninja V and the Atomos Shogun Inferno, both having between 1000 nits and 1500 nits, which I would say is the minimum that you need for shooting anything outdoors. Again, with that substantial hike in the price of the 6K, I really hope that I'm gonna see a brighter screen once I get the camera. Also talking about the screen, I'm sure that everyone has already seen this Chinese hack that added a flip screen to the existing 4K camera, which is pretty amazing, and I was very tempted to get it done on my camera. I would really hope that BlackMagic would consider applying this in their next camera. Another important thing that is missing from the 6K that I already mentioned is the absence of ProRes recording at 6K. As you can see from their chart, 6K and 5K resolution are pretty much exclusive to the RAW format they have, while the ProRes is only covering the 4K downwards. This is probably a strategic marketing push for them to push us to use DaVinci Resolve with the camera, especially that it's the only software that can actually read the BlackMagic RAW. And honestly, DaVinci is a beast of a software, and it's definitely worth considering. One more important point is that when we compare the 4K to the 6K, we can see that the bottom part of the camera is a lot longer now due to the EF lens mount that is protruding forward. With that in place, I definitely wish that they would have had another tripod mounting point right below the lens mount. I know this is very uncommon in any DSLR, but let's face it, this is not a DSLR for photography, this is a DSLR for filmmaking, and filmmakers do need that second point in their cameras. I think it was a coincidence that Metabone just launched on the same day of the launch of the 6K a new Metabone adapter specifically designed for the BlackMagic 4K, where the adapter mounting point aligns exactly with the bottom of the camera. Now another feature probably everyone is wishing for is to have an internal body image stabilization. That would probably get the camera closer to perfection, and it would throw it to compete on a much different level now. So to summarize all this, I'm going to talk about the advantages of the cameras against each other. So starting with the 4K, when you add a speed booster, you get a wider compatible lens range. As I said, you can get a micro four thirds, you can add the EF, you can add vintage lenses, simply because the flange distance is much shorter than the EF mount. Of course, with the different amount of adapters or speed boosters you add to it, you will get more crop factor choices to choose from. And when you add the Metabone Ultra or Metabone XL, you will get a wider field of view than the 6K. So in other words, if you need to shoot super wide, then you might as well use the 4K with a Metabone XL and a wide lens over using a 6K with a wide lens. The 4K is of course half the price, and it's 25% lighter, if that's gonna make any difference to you. Now the 6K advantage over the 4K is that of course it's high resolution, which is the obvious. It will have a shallower depth of field, which is an aesthetic of the full frame that we all look for. And as I mentioned, that theoretically, I assume it's gonna have less noise at 120 frames. This is not proven or written anywhere, this is my own assumption, and I will test it once I get the camera. So you might be wondering now whether the 6K is good for you or not. The answer might be yes if you need the 6K resolution for all the reasons that I already mentioned before, or if you're a DaVinci Resolve user, which will make you benefit from the 6K raw image that the camera will offer you, or if you're someone who's really seeking the shallower depth of field as an aesthetic choice. But again, the difference might not be that substantial. I will try to test it once I get the camera against the 4K and the Metabone. Or maybe if you have the 4K and you shoot a lot of interviews and you need a second camera, and of course you can afford it. Or maybe if you never had any Micro Four Thirds camera and all the lenses that you have are EF lenses, then this way you will save yourself the price of the Metabones adapter, which is $650, which is pretty much a substantial price considering that it's almost half the price of the 4K camera. And finally, if you need a higher res and cleaner 120 frames per second footage, which again is something I'm gonna test once I get the camera. I should be getting the camera in a couple of days, so don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell icon to get notified once I upload the full review of my camera. I'll also leave a link of a music video that I shot with the BlackMagic 4K, which I'm going to be using in a case study to show you how I managed to get the best out of this camera. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you next time.